Here we are, Unit 2, one of the best units of all the units when you learn about this, because this is the interactions of the branches of government. And for this section, we're specifically focusing on the executive branch and the expansion of presidential power that's happened. So you have the idea of what the presidency was at the early republic in the Constitution, and then over time, the presidency has expanded to be a much larger role that we have before us now. And for this video, I have my friend Abraham Lincoln. He was an executive, remember, to help us through this. All right, so in this image, I have on the right our first executive under the Constitution, George Washington. On our left, we have the third executive who did grow the power of the executive already a bit since the times of Washington, and that's Thomas Jefferson. And in the middle, you'll see President Joseph Biden. He is our current president. So that is why you'll see me referring to him in these videos. If you're watching this in the future, it may be a different president, so things might be different. If you're watching this in the past, you made a time machine, well, good for you. All right, so what I want you to think about is if we have a national crisis, right? We've lived through COVID. Hopefully, we don't live through another attack on our country or a natural disaster, right? But if a crisis was to happen and you think, okay, our government has to help. If there was an individual who you think is going to help us, who do you think of? All right. Raise your hand if you thought, I know who should help us. It should be our Senate minority leader. He was a majority leader. So even replace Mitch McConnell with Chuck Schumer, if you will. Or raise your hand if you think that it should be the president. All right. Most people are going to look for the president, for the executive, right? So even as citizens, we sort of place a lot of expectations and assume the presidency has a lot of power, even if they might not technically have that power. That tends to be who we turn to, the presidency, even though Congress probably has a lot more power to do a lot more things, right? So why may Congress actually technically have some powers in that first place? Let's go back to our founding, right? Let's go back to the creation of the Constitution. Let's think of the people who were afraid of the Constitution. What were they afraid of, right? So we know someone who was not a fan of the Constitution. That was Brutus. Okay, not this Brutus, but that's the name they used, right? The anti-federalist. And they did not want a strong executive. There was no executive even under the Articles of Confederation. They wanted that sort of executive authority to just remain in the states. Every state could have their executive. We did not need one over the nation. So this is just one example in Brutus's piece that the command of all troops and a long list of other things must be lodged and exercised in every state in the hands of a few, right? We don't need some dude, there was no Washington, D.C. yet, but we don't need some dude in a capital telling each state where that they need troops and put our people of our state's lives at risk. No, let the executives in every state decide this. Well, we sort of learned under the Articles of Confederation that this was a mess. I'm not saying Brutus didn't have some very valid points. We know the Anti-Federalists did, right? But what was happening, right? It was very ineffective. Some states weren't giving troops. Some states weren't paying enough for troops. We had revolutionary soldiers without weapons, without ammunition, without clothing on their back or shoes on their feet. All right, so this is not going to work. You need some executive, according to Hamilton and those that ratified the Constitution, to have a more effective system. All right, Hamilton did not like What was going on with the lack of executive under the Articles? And in some of the Federalist papers, especially Federalist 70, he explains why an executive is necessary. And he said, a feeble executive exemplifies a feeble execution of the government. If you're going to make an executive under this Constitution, you better darn well make a strong one. Because if you have a weak executive, it's going to be a weak government, and it's not going to fail. And no one's going to take it seriously, and it's going to have no authority to get stuff done. So how do we make this executive with energy, is a word he liked to use. How do we make this energetic executive? All right. Once this executive is created under the under the Constitution, remember Article 2, that's where it comes in. Article 2 is the article that lays out the presidency in our Constitution. 1 is legislative, 2 is executive. And when we turn to the Constitution, we see 3 different types of powers that our president has. The first one is express powers. The second one is implied powers. And the third one is inherent powers. So you do want to know a little bit of the difference of the types of 3. So I'm going to give you some examples. So express powers, these are powers of the president that the president has that are explicitly given in Article 2. It says the president has the power to do this, right? That is an express power. So some examples of that would be the take care clause and the vesting clause, which we will discuss. But we also have express powers of the commander in chief. So you see here the president as commander in chief. That's General Miley, who just recently retired about a month ago, to on our left, right? So a president's commander in chief, that's explicitly laid out in Article 2 of the Constitution. Now, what are implied powers? Implied powers are powers that are implied in Article 2. They're not spelled out as directly as the express powers, but they're necessary for the operation of government, right? In order to carry out the expressed powers, in order for things to be done, it's sort of implied that these are the powers that the president has as well. So that would come to other things we'll discuss, like executive privilege, executive agreements. What are executive orders? So far, President Biden has given, I think it's 144 executive orders. I can check. You can check. The most recent one, as of date, this is recorded on November 12th of 2023, is, I believe, October. On October 30th, Biden signed an executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI, of artificial intelligence. And he gave 2 in September. One on the continuance of federal advisory committees on amendments to other executive orders. So he basically has an executive order on people looking for amendments on executive orders. And another one on ensuring the people of East Palestine are protected now and in the future. Keep in mind, this was September 20th. This is not October, right? So this is something that has grown. We can look at a chart and how many executive orders has each president given. So yeah, as of now, 124 executive orders by President Biden. And the third is inherent powers. So these are not powers really spelled out in the Constitution. They're not implied, but basically all governments have these powers, right? It's what makes a state sovereign. When I say state, I don't mean like 50 states. I mean like a country as a state, right? So it doesn't have to be explicitly laid out in the Constitution, but it's basically a power that a government has. So it sort of makes sense that it falls under the executive branch. So some examples, and I didn't put Biden here because I tried to think of a more relevant one, was the power to acquire new territory. So Thomas Jefferson, this was a big deal when they acquired, he basically doubled the size of the United States, you've learned about, in the Louisiana Purchase. And Jefferson actually wasn't sure. Like, I don't think this is constitutional because he really believed, like, no, unless if it's explicitly like spelled out, I can't do this. He criticized other presidents for that. He criticized Washington for that a heck of a lot, right? But people are like, Tommy, you can't turn down the Louisiana Purchase. You can't do it. You got to find a way. And they're like, well, this is basically like, and that's a long history lesson. But regardless, it's an inherent power that acquiring new territory. It could also be the emergency powers, right? Hey, President Lincoln, right? Which one would you refer to? Well, during the Civil War. Yeah, what did you do then? I suspended habeas corpus, right? That's just an inherent power that during wartime, you may, as a president, need to use some emergency powers. Those are always still controversial, right? Oh, tell me about it. Give me a really hard time. I'm not a good impressionist, so I apologize. All right. So going back to the need for this energetic president, we'll look a lot at Federalist 70, which was a Federalist paper. It was one of Hamilton's Federalist papers. And he basically gives the ingredients. What are the ingredients for this energy in the executive? I'm just going to give you two here. There's more. It's a little cliffhanger, right? And we'll talk about unity and duration. So unity, think of the fact that it's one president. The executive branch is it's the powers are unified in one individual. It's not, because some people are like, listen, we don't want a king, so we don't like this idea of one executive. Maybe it should be like a group of three or something. Huh? You know, like that? And Hamilton's like, no, I don't like that at all. What about duration? How long should someone be president? Remember, when the Constitution was ratified, there was no limits on how many terms a president could have, right? And Hamilton's like, well, you need them to be in office for enough time to actually like do things, right? To accomplish their goals. So originally you had unlimited terms. So this idea of unity, the multiplication of the executive, so like more than one, right, adds to the difficulty of detection in either case. So there's a bunch of reasons why Hamilton was against having many individuals in the executive branch. Of course, there's more than one person in the executive branch, but there's like one head executive, right? And so one of the many reasons is like it just makes all sorts of problems. Think of the Spider-Man meme. If something goes wrong and there's more than one executive, that was their fault. No, that was that executive's fault. Oh, whoa. That was there, right? They're all going to pass the buck. They're all going to pass blame, right? You have no one person, no Harry Truman. The buck stops here. No one person, right? And that's one of those reasons Hamilton pointed out why you need. There's more, right? But unity, that's the idea of unity, and the executive was having one executive. Remember the goal here, right? No tyranny. Anti-Federalists were afraid that having this one person would just put a little crown on their head. And so the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, like, listen, we need this executive, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be a king. That doesn't mean they're going to be a tyrant. In fact, maybe Congress will be more tyrannical. Maybe the majority of the people will be the ones being more tyrannical. So that was a big concern, right? No tyranny. And one more thing to think about. There was something else in my mind. I'm going to come back to it. I'll tell you in class. I had a train of thought here. But the point is I wanted to make is that lots of people accuse Hamilton of being a monarchist for many reasons. One, because he didn't want terms on the presidency. Of course, he wasn't the only one. That's the Constitution that was ratified, right? And while he admired many parts of the British government, and while he wanted a strong executive, that's a story that you probably don't want to read too much into, that Hamilton was a monarchist. Read my professor, Stephen Knott. Read many of his books, and he'll explain Why just wanting a strong executive, amongst other things, does not mean you are a monarchist and didn't believe in democracy or something like that. All right. So before we leave, I want to illustrate, you should know the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment after FDR, right? We know he spent more than 2 terms, right? So even though there was unlimited terms for the presidency, presidents basically followed Washington's precedent of 2 terms and you're done. FDR did not. And they did then, remember, it's not easy to get an amendment passed, right? But the 22nd Amendment was passed, that said 2 terms and that's it. And there's some different criteria if, like, you die at the end, you're vice president and you pick up the end of one, right? But basically 2 terms. And some people have thought that should be overturned. There was a big movement, gosh, at the end of Reagan's 2 terms to but like they never get much traction, right? Um, but it did change the role of the presidency because even though it was a precedent, well, you technically could run again before. Now you can. And what that has created is the lame duck presidency. So basically, once you're in your second term, if you win a second term, you're considered a lame duck. So the last lame duck president we had was President Obama, which means for that second term, what the ability you have to get certain things done is different now. Um, you're not as accountable for your actions because you're not going to run again, right? So you may try harder for certain things. You might not care about certain things. So it's just good to understand the 22nd Amendment and this idea of a lame duck presidency has changed the role of the presidency, along with many other things. All right, we're going to talk more about Federalist 70 and the other ingredients of the energetic presidency. And we'll talk a lot more about the executive in general. But hopefully this was a good start. All right, later.